team comprehensively working on two different aspects from prevention to palliation. And so if I look at this whole journey, we have really had a very exciting journey because we built from 4 or 5 people and now it is about 100 plus. As you see here, 80 plus, that was last year in 2019 with Celebrity Ticket. Now we have added another 20 odd people. So this has got consultants, so many clinicians, DNB program, every specialty of the DNB program, surgical, medical, radiation, our fellowship programs into musculoskeletal, breast, uro-oncology has brought focus to subspecialization. And this team is divided into DMG-based model where a head neck team, thoracic team, breast, GI, gynae, uro, all of them work separately. And that helps us bring real quaternary care to our patients and helps us connect with the medical fraternity in a more focused manner. And this is our strength. And actually, if you look at the multidisciplinary structure in not just medical, surgical, radiation, even radiology, pathology, molecular oncology, everything is integrated very well in the program. And when a particular specialty comes, for example, a thoracic oncology, even the pulmonology team works closely with us. And as Ashish Jain has joined this afternoon from the pulmonology team, we have got Dr. Vivek Nangia, Dr. Ajay Lal, Dr. Naveen Kishore, and Dr. So there is a comprehensive team across centers. So this is our team in the South Zone, which is at Saket, Lajpat Nagar, and Gurgaon. As you will see here, about 9 medical oncologists, 14 surgical oncologists, and so many radiation oncologists. This is divided on the right side. You have a DMG-based specialized work where each one is working into 1 or 2 DMGs, not more than that generally. Even though there are few, as we build our program, we bring more and more focus. And within the team, there's a lot of trust and conviction that we have to build this to real specialized, subspecialized level. So next slide, Shubham. So this is our South Zone team. And as in medical oncology, Dr. Nitesh Rohgi, Devrat Arya, Shefali Sadana represent the medical oncology team. From surgical oncology, Shubham Jain and myself are there. And you also have in the program, Dr. Shubham Garg, who is a thoracic surgical oncologist at Max Patparganj Vaishali and the East Zone, and who is here. He's hosting the NALCI-Con, he's the organizing secretary. So we have the privilege of having him this afternoon. In the radiation oncology, Charu Garg and Priyanka Singh are serving that. Now, the other people joined the program. Ashish Jain, as I mentioned, of pulmonology. Dr. Sanjeev Kumar is from Bihar, Ranchi. He's an oncosurgeon. He's done his MSH from Tata Memorial Hospital. He's a GI surgical oncologist. Vivek Verma is the musculoskeletal oncologist who is also doing his OPD regularly in Ranchi. And Dr. Gaurav Chandna is a palliative care specialist. So this is the team which is you will be interacting this afternoon. We have also successfully created a very systematic approach to tumor boards, and all our patients are routed through tumor boards. So each one of us, whosoever sees a patient, captures all the data and then shares it on a weekly organ-based tumor boards. So that ensures that each of one is connecting on the same page. For example, a thoracic tumor board happens every Saturday morning. And Saturday morning, 9 to 10 is the thoracic tumor board. Today, we are having all these meetings virtually. When pre-COVID times, it was all real tumor boards and was happening. But now it is a virtual tumor board. And so with this, I want to hand over to Shubham Jain to take us through the journey on case-based discussion. And before I hand over, I want to just request each of one of you to register for our NALCI-Con, which is going to be a really phenomenal event. We have got amazing. We've already got close to 400 registrations without faculty registrations. So it is going to be a mega event. We have got a platform, virtual platform. I hope my colleagues will discuss in more detail, and you can see the abstract submission date is extended to 24th. And the biggest prize in abstract, best abstract is 1 lakh rupees. So we want to really entice our young students and young faculty to participate with full enthusiasm and share their ideas, their thoughts, their data to build something which will be transformational in true sense. So thank you very much, Shubham, and please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So Dr. Sarkar, as you were discussing, we've kept the presentation very crisp and brief with regards to the presentations of the lung cancer that pulmonologists commonly come across.
Before you start the actual webinar, case-based, whatever may be, if you allow me to say something about my view, that's just 1 minute. Okay. So, good evening, everybody. On behalf of Jharkhand Chest Society, I welcome you all in today's webinar I congratulate the whole team of Cancer Care Department of Max Hospital, Saket, and convey my special thanks to Dr. Shubham Jain for this great initiative and organizing this webinar on lung cancer, particularly pulmonologist perspective, in association with our pulmonologist of Jharkhand. And with regards to the lung cancer, my opinion or view is that lung cancer management is fast evolving, but now it is in the area of precision medicine, and treatment is first becoming molecular based. Accurate diagnosis and staging is of paramount importance in deciding treatment and outcome. And tissue diagnosis is the gold standard for the diagnosis as well as the molecular analysis. And I think pulmonologists are an integral part of the lung cancer diagnosis. Now, discovery of the targeted therapy in molecular-driven cancers and discovery of immunotherapy has resulted in a paradigm shift in the lung cancer therapy to a more personalized based approach in treatment. But the lung cancer status in our country is definitely very low. There is a rising burden of lung cancer in India. As per information I can gather, 6.9% of the all cancers, new cancers, and 9.3% of all cancer-related deaths are due to lung cancer. And it is the commonest cancer and cancer-related death in men. Mortality trends are also not declining. 5-year survival are very dismal to the tune of 5 to 10%, if I correct. The main cause of this problem is that in our country, it is late diagnosis of lung cancer has a great problem. More than 80% are diagnosed in the stage 3 or stage 4. Diagnosis at stage 1 is almost 0. At the most, diagnosis in early stage 1 and 2 combinedly is about 4 to 5%, most likely. And if we think about why this is the problem in our country, late diagnosis and poor survival of the lung cancer, a number of factors can be think about. Long asymptomatic period of the lung cancer, that long preclinical stage, that is development of the disease and the development of sign symptom, there is a long period. That is a problem, in which case most likely biomarkers or screening can detect this patient, but it is not possible in our country. Moreover, when the patient presents with symptoms, these are almost non-specific symptoms, cough symptom, weight loss, hemoptysis, which are often confused with the underlying disease. And a wrong diagnosis and inappropriate diagnosis and another great problem. All shadows in the chest X-ray are considered to be TB still now by many of the physicians in our country, and that leads to misdiagnosis of TB. And differentiation from pulmonary TB and cancer is an important issue on the clinical and radiological ground. So lack of sensitization of the primary care physician still a great problem. And another 2 points I want to add here, that the diagnostic facilities are not universally available. Testing for molecular biomarkers are not universally available. Chemotherapeutic drugs are costly, toxic. Targeted therapy and immunotherapy are also costly and may not be affordable for most of the patients. And last but not the least, insufficient number of qualified medical oncologists and dedicated thoracic surgeons and oncosurgeons are there persisting in our country. So we hope the webinar will be very much useful and successful with regard to learning and knowledge on the current development in the lung cancer management as a whole. So hoping this, thank you everybody. And I hand over the mic to Dr. Shubham Jain, please, to start the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Sarkar. And that's exactly the purpose of this webinar, wherein after a discussion with you, we've kept it knowingly as something talking about common presentations that a pulmonologist comes across and how actually knowing a good oncology team could help the patient, wherein the patient can be easily referred and the treatment can be sought. And we'll share examples with you of how actually we've made differences to the patient's outcomes. And these are all real life examples that we've made differences to the patient's outcomes genuinely. And that's what we try to show you. So as I was discussing, the common presentations that we do see for lung cancers could be cough, breathlessness, chest pain, hemoptysis, hoarseness of voice, headache, bone pain, and weight loss. And we will be discussing individual case-based scenarios regarding all these presentations that we commonly see. So talking about the persistent cough, I'm sharing the case of a 65-year-old gentleman who's a non-smoker with no known comorbidities, and he started complaining of chronic cough for 1 month when he presented to a pulmonologist. Dr. Ashish, if you can pitch in, what would be the first investigation from your end for a patient complaining of chronic cough, and how would you want to proceed with such a case? Dr. Ashish?
Yes. Shubham, thank you very much for inviting me in this. And good evening, Dr. Shyamal Sarkar and rest of the other members who are there with us this evening. One thing, Shubham, in the previous slide, which I would like to add on, you have listed that, the cough, breathlessness, chest pain, hemoptysis, and etc. are the symptoms, common presentations. But one of the other common presentation is a asymptomatic individual without any of these symptoms, and the person gets an X-ray done for a visa purpose or for a general health checkup, and there is an incidental finding of a lung mass in the X-ray. That is also quite a common presentation in, the lung cancer, as you know, comes in very insidiously and it declares only at a very later stage. So this is one very important point that should be stressed, that even if the patient is, especially the smokers and those who are at a high risk group, they should be screened regularly for any possibility of lung malignancy.
Sure.
Now you had a question for me.
So 65-year-old gentleman with chronic cough, what would be your first test, and how would you proceed in this?
Well, given the circumstances that you have already shown, the gentleman has got a PET CT scan done and he has got a left hilar mass which is diagnosed. So I would straight away go for a EBUS TBNA. However, given the CT scan imaging or the PET CT scan that you are showing, the other option that we can consider would be a CT guided FNAC as well, FNAC biopsy, CT guided as well. But yes, the EBUS TBNA, endobronchial ultrasound TBNA, would be a reasonable option, wherein we can not only give you the diagnosis also, as well as stage this, and plus we need to see the PET CT scan also. If there is intrabronchial growth, then a bronchoscopy would be a bronchoscopic biopsy would be a appropriate.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So, as was in this patient, actually, he had presented with a hilar mass, and we were strongly suspecting a malignancy. Did a bronchoscopy, which confirmed a squamous carcinoma, and the PET CT showed a hilar mass along with the metastatic workup showing liver mets. Dr. Devrat, so this is one of the most common presentations of lung cancer, wherein, as Dr. Ashish was saying, the patient presents in advanced stages. So, given these clinical inputs, how would you proceed with this patient?
Yeah, so considering he is a squamous cell carcinoma, non-smoker, a very small percentage of these patients may still harbor a EGFR mutation, although admittedly EGFR mutations and other mutations are much more common in non-small cell, non-squamous, where, with the current paradigm, we have nearly 1 in 3 patients being diagnosed with some sort of targetable mutation, which can then be alter therapy in a fashion where we, instead of giving them chemotherapy or immunotherapy, actually treat them with oral drugs. And you have the list on the slide here. The list is ever growing, the number of mutations that now we know that can be targeted. But for most squamous cell carcinomas, these patients would be EGFR negative. Commonly, they're not tested for other mutations. And then for a stage 4 patient, the options traditionally would have been chemotherapy alone. However, in the past couple of years, it's changed with the advent of immunotherapy, where we also subject them to a test called PD-L1 test, which is a biomarker for response to immunotherapy. And those patients who, in fact, are heavily PD-L1 positive may be treated with immunotherapy alone, which is a chemo-free regimen. Whereas for the rest of the patients, a combination of immunotherapy along with chemotherapy has actually led to improved survivals.
Okay. So this is what you were talking about basically with the immunotherapy, I believe.
Right.
Great. So the next common presentation that I feel patients present with is shortness of breath or breathlessness. So Dr. Ashish, coming back to you, This is an X-ray of a 70-year-old lady who presented with complaints of progressive breathlessness, and on X-ray there was left massive pleural effusion. How would you proceed in this patient, sir?
Well, all these pleural effusions first would be get tapped, but obvious, they would get tapped, and we would send these pleural effusion for investigation, including the cytology. Looking at the age of the 70 years, malignancy remains high on the cards, and obviously tuberculosis is the other thing that one would presume in India. So I would first tap this lady, send it for examination based on the biochemical analysis. One would try and figure out what it is. Cytology may prove helpful to us. And obviously, if there is a strong indication, or if there is a strong suspicion rather of malignancy, then I would straight away go for a CT scan also. And if the pleural effusion, if it comes as positive, then definitely we'll go directly for the PET CT scan. As regards to the diagnosis, it will depend upon the PET CT scan. If there is any other mass lesion which needs to be targeted either via CT guided biopsy or bronchoscopically, if there is nothing else, and if there are pleural mets, pleural deposits, then I would prefer for a medical thoracoscopy for a pleural biopsy. Oh, here you are. Good.
So can you explain us more about the medical thoracoscopy that you were talking about?
So medical thoracoscopy, unlike a surgical thoracoscopy, is done by a single port. There are two devices that are available. One is the flexi rigid, as well as the second is the rigid. What we do here in our center is the rigid bronchoscopy, single port rigid bronchoscopy. Now and this is done under a minimal sedation with midazolam, fentanyl, and at times we may need some propofol, and the patient is quite comfortable with this, breathing on their own. The patient is made to lie on the affected side up. We make a single port entry. We go inside, drain the entire fluid, examine the both the pleural surfaces, and like I can see a lot of pleural deposits here in the photograph that you have shown. We can very easily take biopsies from those areas, and not only they are much better than any pleural fluid cytology. Number one, they are biopsies. Number two, they are biopsies done under visualization. We see the lesion and then we take them, and plus we give you enough material for all the immunological markers that you may want to do on this. Very safe procedure, no problem. And at times when you know that you are going in for a malignant pleural effusion, in the same sitting, we can also do a pleurodesis, so that this recurrent pleural effusion, recurrent refilling, that is taken care of at the same time.
Great, thank you. So quickly going on to the third presentation that I feel we commonly see.
So regarding pleural effusion here.
Yes, sir, Dr. Sarkar, you wanted to ask something?
So tell us, Lopas, when to suspect that it can be a malignant pleural effusion, not the tubercular one. When to suspect? The first step usually done, we tap the fluid and examine the fluid. And when the physicians who suspect that this is not tubercular or other etiology, it can be malignant. What are the criteria that should be pointed out here? So then we think about the medical thoracoscopy. So straight away, the medical thoracoscopic facility are not available everywhere. So physician in this small town can face this patient and do a pleural tapping and detailed examination of the pleural fluid, which is not showing malignant cells there. It is exudative, lymphocytic, with ADA 47 like that. So when to suspect that we should go ahead for the further investigation, not treating it blindly as tuberculosis. What are the factors that could lead to suspicion?
So a lymphocytic exudative effusion with not a very high ADA in an elderly gentleman or in an elderly lady smoker, and the cytology obviously is very difficult to get. but a high sugar level in an exudative effusion in an elderly gentleman, smoker in smoking habits, and not very high ADA. These are the things that one should suspect this. Plus a hemorrhagic effusion, if you go by physical examination, a hemorrhagic pleural effusion gives us a strong indication that we must not stop only at tuberculosis and go further beyond and start investigating for any malignancy.
Okay, so hemorrhagic pleural effusion can also occur in tubercular as well.
Yeah, it can. But
and malignant pleural effusion can have straw-colored pleural fluid as well.
Yes, both these things are there.
So what other important factors has to be considered here? So considering age, considering the other risk factors of smoking history, and a borderline ADA, and having recurrent collections. Many a times we see the recurrent pleural collection. So that is a very important clinical pointer here. So physicians.
Yes, exactly. I was discussing about the first time presentation, but yes, you're right. A recurrent pleural effusion is a strong indicator of a malignancy, which usually we do not see in cases of tuberculosis.
So any physician, whenever find this, that first time tapping, having exudative pleural effusion, lymphocytic borderline ADA, so it will give an impulse to start ATT, in fact. And whenever the patient comes with recurrent collection with poor response, so here should be the patient, doctor must have a high index of suspicion that this might not be tubercular. We should not delay. So a medical thoracoscopy is very much needed, and that has to be referred.
Sir, also, if I can weigh in, sir, when you suspect recurrent pleural effusions, sometimes the second tap that you do comes out actually to be hemorrhagic, and it is because of the first puncture that you have done. So always we should not go by just by the color of the fluid, although it's an indicator, but it is not a definite indicator. And we as pulmonologists and as oncophysicians should lower our threshold to do a medical thoracoscopy, because as Dr. Ashish said, it is not only safe, the cost can also be brought down. If you ask me as a surgeon, for me to do a wax biopsy, it's going to be at least 4 times costlier than for you as a pulmonologist to do a medical thoracoscopy, and it is only possible when you have sufficient fluid in the system. If the fluid is all drained, lung will expand, and that time you will not be able to do a medical thoracoscopy. So that is why it is advisable that the practice of medical thoracoscopy creeps into the system, and you start taking more and more pleural biopsy, and we reduce the chances of starting tuberculosis ATT empirically.
Yes.
Very valid point, Shubham. Very valid point. And here one more thing that I would like to stress is that, if you delay doing a medical thoracoscopy in these kind of patients, then what happens is that there are adhesions that start forming. So it not only becomes difficult for us to access that, it's difficult for us to, take a tissue from that, as well as the pleurodesis becomes ineffective in these kind of patients.
Yes, I agree. I agree, Doctor. Yes, I agree with Dr. Ashish. Yes.
So also, I feel after draining the pleural fluid, we should also subject the patient to a CT thorax if feasible, because if there is a lung mass, and then that may help in guiding the further course of action a lot.
Yes, or pleural nodule are easily visible in that sense. We can have a suspicion. But it is sure, I agree with Dr. Ashish that there should not be much delay of doing medical thoracoscopy. We should take the advantage of medical thoracoscopy because it will clinch the diagnosis, whether tubercular or whether malignancy, it will clinch the diagnosis.
Exactly.
That is the most important thing.
Yeah. And I think we should always stress on the history also, the systemic symptoms, the history of fever, weight loss, although it will be somewhere, overlapping, but still fever and weight loss is more commonly seen in tuberculosis. So if it is a long-standing kind of a thing, that would again give us some hint about it.
So quickly moving to the next common presentation that may be seen. So this is a 62-year-old lady, again a non-smoker, who presented with complaints of left-sided chest pain, and her CECT showed a left lower lobe mass with chest wall infiltration. So the biopsy of this patient is a non-small cell lung cancer, adenocarcinoma, and the metastatic workup was not showing any evidence of metastasis. So Dr. Charu, how would you want to approach this patient? What would be your course of treatment? And How would you want to deal with it?
So Shubham, this would be a T3 kind of a tumor. And first it would be in your domain if you want to operate. That would be the first thing. But I think looking at the size, I am not too sure whether you would like to operate this. And then the second best option would be to subject this patient to radical RTCT, radical radiotherapy along with concurrent chemo. And like Dr. Sarkar was addressing that most of the patients who come to us are in stage 3 and 4. And, 3B and 4, it becomes almost impossible to operate these patients. And these are the, major chunk of patients who would be, appropriate for radical radiotherapy along with concurrent chemo.
And Dr. Devrat, if the resources are not constrained, you would want to add some, as Dr. Charu was saying, concurrent chemotherapy or some more targeted therapy to this?
Yeah, so I would agree with Dr. Charu that whenever surgery is not feasible, the next radical treatment option is concurrent chemoradiation, and we have different chemotherapy protocols. And the choice of chemotherapy depends more on the patient's fitness rather than the subtype, at least in this stage of disease. While there has been a lot of debate as to the role of consolidative chemotherapy after the end of radical chemoradiation, there certainly has been now some data coming up with immunotherapy, and one drug that has shown a lot of promise through a phase 3 trial is a drug called durvalumab. And we've used this in our clinical setting as well. And usage of this immunotherapeutic agent for a year after the end of CTRT has actually led to an improvement in survival, so higher cure rates. And that's what, if resources are not a constraint, I would advise concurrent chemotherapy, and a month after this the conclusion of chemoradiation, a CT scan to rule out progression, followed by initiation of durvalumab. Obviously, there will be cases where resources are a constraint. Immunotherapeutic drugs are still very expensive. In which case, most of the scenarios, if I've used a weekly paclitaxel concurrent with radiation, I would like to give at least 2, if not 4 cycles of consolidative chemotherapy.
And how long would the treatment duration last for this kind of a patient, Dr. Charu and Dr. Devrat?
So radiation would be typically for 6 to 6.5 weeks, along with concurrent weekly chemo. And after that, Devrat can take it?
Yeah, so the concurrent chemotherapy goes on as long as the radiation is going on. And if as I said, if resources are not a constraint, we'd want to give a year of immunotherapy with PET scans being done every 3 to 4 months to assess response and rule out progression. However, if the patient cannot afford chemotherapy, the immunotherapy, the choice is to do chemotherapy, and that takes about 2 to 3 months in most cases. There's also been some interest in using anti-EGFR drugs. So for adenocarcinoma, there have been some Chinese studies looking at giving them oral targeted therapies instead of chemotherapy as consolidation. Again, data is still not very mature, but in the future, they could potentially be treatment options in lieu of immunotherapy or chemotherapy in the consolidative phase.
Okay, thank you. So another common presentation that we see for lung cancer.
Dr. Jain, can I ask a question in the previous case here?
Yes. Sir.
So you have told that there is a left lower lobe mass with chest wall infiltration, and biopsy shows adenocarcinoma. Now I want to discuss in this situation. So doctor should know what should be the type of biopsy here, whether bronchoscopy or CT biopsy. So here the lesion is in the periphery involving the chest wall. So doctors, what would be their advice for the biopsy here?
It should be a CT guided biopsy in this case, because the mass lesion is very easily amenable.
Yes.
So normally the central masses or the nodes, whenever they are there, then we refer the patients to our pulmonologist to do a bronchoscopy or a EBUS guided FNA and a biopsy. So when even they are doing within EBUS where they cannot take a biopsy, they do a FNAC, but then they make a cell block. So we can even have a molecular markers done on that cell block. So not necessarily that, every time we have to do a biopsy, but this case is, very good for a CT guided biopsy because the lesion is very peripherally placed, and we can have a good core needle biopsy from this.
So as it is peripheral lesion involving chest wall, so here the mode of biopsy treatment will be CT guided. And most of the cases what happens here, the CT guided FNA is taken. And that creates a lot of problems. Sufficient tissue is not coming there. And again, needs second biopsy or second times harassment for the patient. So whether CT guided FNA or CT guided core biopsy, I think it is CT guided core biopsy. It can be done in the setup. That will be the correct process of diagnosis.
Sure.
In this
And
patient, we may
also-
also subject him to an ultrasound guided core biopsy, the way it is extending up to the periphery.
Okay. The second thing, after diagnosis of adenocarcinoma here, that is the pathological diagnosis again. I want to know, you have written here the metastatic workup has been done. What actually metastatic workup you do routinely? What is the metastatic workup you do regularly in such cases? That's one.
Dr. Devrat, you were saying something, and if you could
Yeah,
answer the
yeah.
question.
So I would say what I wanted to say, and I'll also answer the question that Dr. Sarkar has asked. While in small cells and FNA, small cell CA lung and FNA may still be sufficient as long as the pathologist is sure that's a small cell CA lung. In most cases with non-small cell, we would lead a core biopsy because a lot of times there may be mixed pathologies as well. It may not be pure adeno or pure squamous. A lot of times it's adenosquamous, and often, especially in the metastatic setting, as a medical oncologist, I would need a lot of tissue to be able to subject these patients to first an IHC to be to be able to label the subtype accurately, because my treatment would depend on whether it's a squamous or an adeno. Even if the patient cannot afford immunotherapy, the drugs that I use for these patients may differ based on the subtype. And as we discussed earlier, a lot of times these patients will also be subjected to additional molecular tests, and for that we need tissue. So your point is absolutely valid, especially in a metastatic setting. I would want at least a core biopsy in these cases. And coming to the second point of what is the right metastatic workup. So what is recommended is an abdominal bone imaging and also a brain imaging. So one could do a CT scan of the abdomen with contrast, a bone scan, and an MRI of the brain. But what's happening increasingly these days is with the cost factor and all, most of these patients are subjected to a PET CT of whole body, which looks at both the thorax and the abdomen and the bone at one go. And obviously, even in limited stage disease, PET CT can have significant information with regards to nodal status, which may then be useful for the surgical oncologist and the radiation oncologist.
So whether PET CT should be done before going to biopsy, before doing biopsy?
Sir, that will depend on what is the degree of suspicion. For example, if you look at this CT scan with speculated margins, large mass with infiltration, I think one could say with a
yes, definitely.
Reasonable amount of confidence that this is likely to be malignancy.
Yes.
But the ideal sequence has to be biopsy first and then metastatic workup, rather than the other way around.
And what are the other role of advising PET CT in case of lung cancer as a whole? If I want to know, what are the situation you will definitely need PET CT?
As I said, obviously, to rule out metastatic disease, sometimes, when you're dealing with a solitary pulmonary nodule, which I believe as a pulmonologist you may encounter frequently, an asymptomatic patient, incidental finding on the CT scan, there are PET scans, especially for nodules which are larger than 8 to 10 millimeter. A degree of uptake in a PET scan may also be able to maybe informative with regards to the possibility of it being malignant versus non-malignant. For any nodule which is less than 6 to 8 millimeter, we can't rely on PET scan and uptake. But for anything bigger than that, it can differentiate between malignancy versus no malignancy. So that's one. Two, for localized proven cancers, PET scan has a fairly high negative predictive value with regards to mediastinal nodes. Unfortunately, in India, you have a lot of FDG avid mediastinal nodes because of the high existence of tuberculosis and therefore positive predictive value is much lesser, and most of these patients would be subjected to a mediastinoscopy or a EBUS or EUS guided FNAC for mediastinal staging. And third, in certain scenarios, there may be equivocal findings of metastasis where a PET with the addition of functional imaging over and above CT scan may actually help us decide whether those equivocal findings are actually metastasis or unlikely to be metastasis.
Thank you.
Great.
Dr. Dev, may I add one or more things? You know, the discussion was on when to do this PET CT scan, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a failed biopsy, if the biopsy is inconclusive, rather than going again with the biopsy, I would rather do a PET CT scan so as to assess that what is the best area within the lesion and what are the other lesions that are available, which can be accessed. So that is one more thing that I would add to the list.
I think that's a good point. That's a great point.
And I think now most of the guidelines, even in a stage 1, would recommend doing a PET CT if it is there and resources are not limited.
Absolutely, and it also gives us some information for local mediastinal staging as well. So if the nodes are not highlighting on the in the mediastinum, then it has a fairly high negative predictive value, and we can choose to ignore doing an invasive mediastinal staging for these patients if we are taking them off for surgery.
For staging the lung cancer patients, whether the PET CT is essential, or you will combine the dual modalities of PET CT and CT guided biopsies. Is there any advantage of doing for the diagnostic purpose as well as for the staging purpose? Is there an advantage of combining this process?
So definitely PET CT is advantageous in the sense that it gives all the information in one go, and it's the FDG avidity also gives us information. But if the resources for a PET are not available, then as Dr. Devrat said, that imaging the abdomen, imaging the chest, and imaging the bone do a fair enough work for staging the disease.
How you did staging in this case? What are the staging?
So in this case, sir, we subjected the patient to a PET CT, and following that, we proceeded with the treatment for this patient.
What is the stage of the disease here?
Sir, so this would be a T3 lesion based on the chest wall infiltration. The nodal stage for this patient was N0. We had done an EBUS TBNA for her, and following that, this patient was subjected to definitive CTRT.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Sarkar, one unrelated point which you may be interested in, which is not related to this malignancy thing. We are seeing a lot of patients with FDG, AVID, mediastinal lymph nodes. And these are the patients who are coming from far areas, you know, around the coal mines and all. And they have got these anthracosis that also presents, you know, sometimes as a lung mass, sometimes as a FDG, AVID lymph nodes. And then we diagnose them, we do the EBUS TBNA and find a tar-like material coming out of the FNAC. And they turn out to be anthracosis. So that's an interesting thing. And there are a lot of patients from Bihar, Jharkhand area, those who are coming to us for getting the, you know, they are suspected to be malignancy, but then they turn out to be anthracosis.
Yes. Granular metastasis.
So discussing the next common presentation. So this actually is an unusual case of a 27-year-old gentleman that we had. He's a non-smoker and presented with complaints of massive hemopsis. I'm playing a video of the bronchoscopy that the patient had done. We had done on the patient. Dr. Ashish, if you would be able to elaborate on the bronchoscopy findings for us. Hello?
Sure.
Yeah. Were you able to see the video, sir?
Yeah. So there is an intraluminal growth, smooth surface, and it looks like pedunculated growth to me. 27-year-old gentleman. Could
Yes,
this be a carcinoid?
Yes, sir, exactly. So it was described as a 3 into 2 centimeter endobronchial smooth marginated growth, and the biopsy of this lesion came as a low-grade mucoepidermoid carcinoma.
Yeah.
The metastatic workup was again non-metastatic. And I'd like to call in Dr. Sanjeev now. Dr. Sanjeev.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. So how would you want to proceed in this patient?
So again, like in non-metastatic workup was negative, and clinical suspicion was more in favor of carcinoid. So firstly, I'd like to see the CT scan in detail to see the relation of the growth with the bronchus, whether it is at the carina or like whether in relation to the secondary this thing. So the relation to the airway, so that I can plan the surgery, and also the relation of the tumor with the vessels, pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein, so that I can plan my resection. So in these cases, like so though lobectomies or pneumonectomies are like standard of care, radical resections, but for these cases we can even go for sleeve resections or subsegmentectomies. So proper planning after a detailed discussion of CT scan is necessary.
Exactly. And so for this patient, we did consider the options of left pneumonectomy versus a sleeve left upper lobectomy. And Dr. Sanjeev, would you want to elaborate on the sleeve lobectomy and how this patient fared for us?
Yeah. So I have a memory because like I was there in the theater. So this tumor, at the takeoff of the upper lobe bronchus, so there was a tumor. It was like at the junction of the upper and lower lobe bronchus. And image-wise, like we were not very sure, like if we'll be able to, remove the tumor without going for a pneumectomy. Another challenge was the vessels, which was closely abutting the tumor. However, intraoperatively, we could separate the tumor from the vessels, and we could remove the tumor with adequate margin. And we did end-to-end anastomosis in interrupted fashion of the bronchus, and we could save pneumonectomies. So sleeve lobectomy was done, sleeve resection was done, and the patient did well. So he recovered uneventful. The recovery was uneventful.
And Dr. Devrat, there wouldn't be any need for any adjuvant therapy for this patient. Low-grade tumor, PT2A, N0 lesion. If I'm correct. Dr. Devrat?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So certainly whenever we are looking at post-surgical treatment for any patient, we look at the size of the tumor, the grade of the tumor, whether there's any lymphovascular invasion or not, and whether any nodes have turned out positive or not. So for any higher grade tumor with lymphovascular invasion, a larger tumor, adjuvant chemotherapy certainly has a role, not so much for this case. And as Dr. Charu would agree, if the patient were to be node positive, particularly mediastinal node positive, there would also be a case for adjuvant radiation therapy for these cases, but certainly not for this patient.
So, thanks. So, Dr. Sarkar, can we go to the next case, or you would want to know? Okay, so we move to the next case.
Yes, next case.
So, next common presentation that we see, as Dr. Ashish was also discussing, was of mediastinal lymphadenopathy, or if a patient were to present with hoarseness of voice. So, this is the case of a 60-year-old gentleman, smoker, hypertensive, who presented with complaints of hoarseness of voice for 2 weeks, and his CT thorax was showing extensive mediastinal lymphadenopathy. So, Dr. Ashish, how would you proceed in such a case? What would be your next best investigation?
So the hoarseness of voice first goes to the ENT usually. That's what happens, and then they try and figure out what it is, and they do a CT scan, and once they find the mediastinal lymphadenopathy or a mass lesion sitting at the apex, and that is causing the hoarseness of voice, that's when the patient either comes to me or to you. And after seeing the CT scan, the first thing would be to find out the area which is best accessible for the biopsy. If it is a peripheral lesion, again, we'll go for a CT-guided biopsy. Otherwise, I would like to do a bronchoscopy if there is an intrabronchial growth, which I can see on the CT scan, or just a simple EBUS TBNA to stage to diagnose the mediastinal lymphadenopathy.
So this patient as well.
all these 2 or 3 modalities are available, and we can tailor made according to the patient's requirement.
So this patient as well was subjected to an EBUS TBNA, and it confirmed a poorly differentiated malignant tumor. But unfortunately, because the quantity is very less, further IHC studies could not be done. So Sanjeev and Dr. Shubham Garg, I want your inputs on this for the role of surgical mediastinoscopy for such a patient. Shubham, are you there? Shubham Garg? Sanjeev, if you can take
Yeah. So mediastinoscopy is again very good modality to stage mediastin for staging mediastinal nodes surgically. So we routinely do video mediastinoscopy at our center. So the main advantage is for like the subcarinal node and the prevascular node. So under visual guidance and in controlled environment, we are able to sample the upper paratracheal, lower paratracheal 2 and 4, and also the subcarinal node. So the main challenge is like the access of the prevascular nodes, which like for blind biopsies or for even for other things, it is very dangerous. But in video mediastinoscopy, we have a correct vision. We can see the vessels. We can dissect. We can also do dissections. We have suctions. We have electrocauteries to control the bleeding, and we can sample the nodes, both sides, the right and left, and accordingly we can accurately stage the mediastinum. We get enough tissue for doing additional tests also if needed. So this is the amount of tissue we get from a mediastinoscope. We can individually station-wise also we can sample the nodes.
So exactly, and Dr. Devrat, you can only highlight the importance of such tissue because in this patient, the final report on IHC actually came out as a DLBCL, and it would have changed the course of the treatment for this patient entirely.
Right, absolutely. You're talking about change in cure rates. You're talking about different chemotherapy regimens. You're talking about treatment which is entirely different. And I think increasingly in our country we are realizing that a lot of times there may be 2 different diagnoses coexisting. Dr. Ashish will also vouch to the fact where we have had patients who not only had a malignancy but also had tuberculosis, and both of them being diagnosed in tissue, and which actually then needed both concurrent ATT and anti-cancer treatment. So tissue is always of paramount importance in lung cancer. I think one couldn't highlight it more.
So exactly. So moving to the next common presentation that we see is headache. Dr. Charu, so this is a 64-year-old lady, known diabetic and hypertensive, known case of right-sided lung cancer treated in 2018. She's on regular follow-up and suddenly develops generalized seizures. The contrast enhanced MRI images are shown, and they show a ring enhancing lesion in the left parietal lobe. The metastatic workup otherwise is negative for this patient at present. So how would you want to proceed?
So I think as we've got better and better modalities systemically, even locally now we have got better modalities. Now this was a patient who had a single brain lesion. The patient was advised to go for a surgical excision, but since it is in an area, it is in a motor area, so the surgeons were not very keen on doing it, and so was the patient. So at all the radiological features, it was a metastatic lesion, and we had 2 options of either giving a whole brain radiation or something called SRS, which is basically a stereotactic radiosurgery, where we can just target this area alone. And it's a day procedure. It prevents all the side effects of the whole brain radiation. And in case the systemic treatment is to be given, that can be started within a short while. We don't have to wait, like after a whole brain radiation, we would normally wait for 2 weeks for its effects to go off. But in an SRS, we can start the chemotherapy next day or the day later. So if you can show the next slide, Shubham. So this is how, we contour, and we can give something like as high as a 20 grade dose to this lesion. In the next slide, you will be able to see that how beautifully the dose conforms to that area only. So you can see the 100% isodose, and in the image on the right side, you can see it is a 50% isodose. So you can see there's hardly any other dose which is going to other parts of the body. And SRS as such has a very good high local control rates of close to 80 to 90%. So this is what we had offered to the patient. And I think this was around March. Until now, the patient is doing well. And with the advent of this oligometastatic disease, otherwise, like, a decade before, prior, had a patient come to us with a, a brain met, we would say, okay, the survival is something like close to 3 to 6 months, and that's it. But now increasingly, we are seeing these kind of patients with targeted therapies and orally, as well as, radiation wise. These patients can at times go on to even 4 to 5 years.
Okay, thank you. So next common presentation again is bone pain or backache, and I'd like to call in Dr. Vivek here.
Dr. Shubham, I just
yes, sir.
So in the previous case, what did you to search the primary source of this case?
So this patient was a known case of right-sided lung cancer, sir. Previously treated in 2018. So that is why we deemed it to be the metastatic lesion. Obviously, Dr. Charu, would you have otherwise done?
Yeah. So normally in these cases, we do advise for a rebiopsy, because at times, even for our medical oncologist colleague, we want a biopsy so we can have, more molecular markers. And at times, it gives us a diagnosis also. And if the patient is not too keen on it, then we go ahead and do MRS, that is spectroscopy, and we do perfusion diffusion scans to sort of, we have to be sure that, we are treating a malignancy only. So if a patient undergoes a biopsy, that is the first thing we advise to the patient.
Is there any chance of other problems like cerebral aspergillosis, because they are immunosuppressed patient?
Yes.
So how will you confirm?
So that is what I'm saying. So biopsy is the first thing which is advised to the patient. If the patient is not keen on that, then it is the radiological features, like, metastatic would have a lot of perilesional edema. It would be, ring-like lesion, which is peripherally enhancing. And then MRS and perfusion scans also come to our aid in, differentiating between these 2-3 differential diagnoses.
Thank you.
Okay. So moving to the next case where the patient may come with bone pain or backache. So Vivek, are you around? So this case is of a 55-year-old gentleman, heavy smoker, complains of pain bilateral knees for a few months, and now has a fracture following trivial trauma. His workup was suggestive of a pathological fracture secondary to lung cancer, and this is his X-ray.
Right.
So how would you approach this patient then, please?
Right.
Yeah.
So mostly the basic principle is that if any patient presents with any pathological fracture or lytic lesion, we have to look at the age. As a general dictum, patients above 40 years of age, we tend to look out for site of primary. And in younger patients, generally we think that this is a primary bone tumor. It also depends upon many factors like number of lesions and the characteristic of the lesion. And nowadays we have got a PET scan, so that is the best modality. And our approach changes when we suspect a primary bone tumor versus a metastatic suspicion. So like when it is a metastatic suspicion, we don't follow that intensively, like we don't go for an MRI or other things, but rather we do a PET scan, which showed in this case that there was a lung tumor. And in such cases, our approach is mostly palliative. And the most important factor that we keep in our mind that we should make the patient mobile as soon as possible. Generally, we do not tend to do the routine type of fixations like plating or nailing, because in a metastatic lesions, these tumors generally do not heal. And we need to give, we know that the survival is less. We need to give them a standard of care which improves their lifestyle and where they can walk. So this is something nowadays we have all these modular processes, and immediately the patient can be made to walk. And of course, we involve the multidisciplinary team regarding chemotherapy and radiotherapy, whatever is required for the primary site as well.
Okay. Dr. Priyanka, if I can have you, what would you do for pain relief for metastatic? So this was a fracture, but if in case there is no fracture, but the bony metastases are painful for the patient? And what can we do for the pain relief?
Radiation is a very good modality for pain relief in bone metastasis. Even with fracture, if the patient has been, the fracture has been taken care of, stabilized, even then we recommend radiation because with surgery we are taking care of the bone stability, but the tumor cells need to be taken care of because otherwise there can be tumor progression later on, which may cause displacement of the processes as well. So palliative intent radiation is a good modality for pain relief.
Okay.
Yes. Just want to add one thing. That's why we tend to replace it rather than fixing or plating. Because when we do a nailing or plating, which is the routine orthopedic procedure, in those cases, we have to add radiation as a modality. But once if we have resected the entire part, then it obviates the need of radiation therapy as well in such cases like this one.
Yes, radiation also helps in bone mineralization in cases where there's no fracture.
Yes.
What is the most common type of lung cancer that causes bone metastasis?
Pardon?
Vivek, would you want to take that question? Most common type of cancer causing bone metastasis?
So actually, I just look at where it is the primary. For me, it doesn't matter what type of cancer, lung cancer it is. I refer it to our thoracic and medical oncology team. But yeah.
Lung cancers are very commonly metastatic to the bone, sir. Apart from that, we could also see, depending on the age and the gender. So breast cancers you see very commonly metastasizing to the bone. In elderly males, it could also be prostate cancers, but definitely lung cancers are one of the most commonly presenting cancers with bone metastasis.
Yes, yes. In these cases, is there any role of biphosphonates? We usually use biphosphonates.
Absolutely, sir. Vivek, would you want to?
Yeah. So yes, generally when there are multiple lesions, we start the patient on bisphosphonates, and usually a monthly dose is given. And nowadays we have a newer modality of rank ligand inhibitors, which is denosumab, which is more potent and cause a better response in ossifying these lesions. Apart from that, depending upon the histological type, I think the chemo or immunotargeted therapy as well starts to help in healing of those lesions with radiation therapy.
Denosumab is a monoclonal antibody.
Yes, sir. It's a monoclonal antibody.
And here, if I can add, Shubham, I'll just take a minute more. Like apart from a long bone you have shown here, similarly, what we did in brain, which is like SRS. Similarly, for the vertebral lesions, we can go ahead and give SBRT, which is stereotactic body radiotherapy. I'm sorry, are you coming to that?
No, I'm just. But this is an unstable fracture, so yes, please continue, ma'am.
So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 12, 11. I think this would be around D10 kind of a thing. But since it is an unstable spine, so it will go to Vivek first, and after that it would come to us for radiation. And even in such cases, like we can give very high doses, and if the patient doesn't have a lot of disease anywhere else in the body, just one region in the lung and 1 or 2 bones, then we can even try giving them radical treatment to these lesions.
Yes, and nowadays the approach has changed, and we do not just look at the spinal stability. In fact, we have to take into account multiple factors and the different criteria, like NOMS, that is neurologically, oncologically, like what is the survival of the patient, what is the neurological status, the mechanicality, and the other factors, other comorbidities. So based on that, of course, it has multiple. You can see even in the sacrum, D10 and above their lytic lesions. So also the sensitivity of the primary histology, whether it is a radio-resistant type, and what type of pressure is it? Is it a soft tissue component which would respond to radiotherapy, or it is a bony fragment which is causing the compression? Most important factor is what is the neurological status and what is the survival. If patient has a neurological deficit, then definitely requires a surgery. And if we are expecting a good survival, something beyond 6 months, and there is mechanical instability in the spine, we tend to fix it. Otherwise, just a simple decompression And when it is not feasible because of the other morbidities, then of course, definitely radiotherapy palliative intent is the treatment of choice.
I think Vivek, you've made a very good point. The expected lifespan of the patient, the available treatment options, the patient's age and performance status are very important in individualizing treatment. So for this patient, young lady, otherwise fit, no comorbidities, I don't think there's a lot of debate. That surgery should have been done and has been done. But I think for a patient who comes with at an age of 80, multiple comorbidities, where I feel that a systemic therapy may not happen, then I would certainly consult you, but also consult Dr. Charu or the radiation oncologist to see what's the easiest way to have effective pain relief or relief of symptoms.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And that is where Dr. Gaurav Channa, our palliative care specialist, also pitches in for the palliative care of such metastatic patients. Dr. Gaurav? Hi.
Hello.
How can you contribute to
Yes, sir.
for this patient in addition to what Dr.
Yes, like I am sure that I would be involved either by Dr. Charu or Dr. Vivek and Dr. Akshay when they are managing these patients according to what Dr. Devras has said, that we will decide, the team of board will decide that how to proceed forward with such a case scenario depending on their age and comorbidity. So they would definitely have a chance to go for surgery if there is a good prognosis, and we'll manage it accordingly with the phase of with severe pain and cord indentation would be presenting with a lot of back pain and sometimes with radiating pain as well. And they will be managed with opioids, steroids, antineuropathics during that time. And if it is decided that the patient would not benefit from radical surgery, and we would likely to proceed with radiotherapy first, and we'll manage the patient along with the lines of palliative intent, and we'll follow the patient and make sure that the patient is comfortable after the radiation therapy at home, and would probably would be following up in person or as proxy depending on the situation of the patient.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav. And one of the last presentations that I have put in the slide, weight loss for patients. And Dr. Gaurav, I'd like you to stay here. This is a case of a 60-year-old gentleman, chronic smoker with medical history of COPD, hypertension, bedridden for 3 months. And he's complained of progressive weight loss in the last 6 months and complaining of chronic cough. He's been diagnosed as a case of metastatic lung cancer and is under evaluation for other options of treatment. So how would you approach this patient, and what would be your recommendations?
Any unintentional weight loss would be an alarming feature for any gastroenterologist or pulmonologist. So a weight loss more than 5% in a patient in past 6 months, regardless of BMI, we would consider that to be evaluated. And when we have found that it is associated with metastatic disease, then we definitely we would like to see that where would we grade that weight loss, and the pathogenesis, as we are aware, for these patients would be associated with energy and metabolic abnormalities and systemic inflammation and reduced intake associated. So we can also say that there would be an cachexia syndrome where there would be less food intake, a weight loss more than around 10%, and systemic inflammatory markers would be raised. So generally we start our intervention based on their individual findings, like whether it is more prominent to see that the patient is having patient would benefit from dietary and nutritional counseling, or the patient is having oral sores, or is having associated GI side effects with chemotherapy, or the patient is mostly advanced cancer patient with poor performance status, and would it would be prudent to encourage him with exercises. Resistance exercises are mostly recommended, but when patients are presenting in metastatic stage, we usually are not able to do that. So we restrict them to as tolerated. We include relaxation, breathing techniques, and sometimes we resort to pharmacological agents, though many agents have been experimented in this. Most commonly which we use is megasterol acetate and corticosteroid, depending on the indications, whether uh, the patient is just not eating or and is continuing with other physical performance duties of taking care of himself and other light duties, or whether the patient has a very less short lifespan and is associated with pain or nausea, we will prefer corticosteroids. So other agents would be used depending their specific indications, like with associated nausea, vomiting, would definitely like to try antipsychotics like olanzapine and haloperidol. And if opioids can be pitched in to improve the physical quality of life, we will include that also. I would definitely take guidance from my other colleagues from radiation and medical oncology in managing such a case scenario.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav. So, Dr. Sarkar, these were the common presentations that we usually see with the lung cancer cases, and I would definitely want to talk about screening for lung cancers.
Yes.
So, we know that heavy smokers between the age of 55 to 75 years, or either current or former smokers recently quit, definitely benefit from screening. And a modality that we now have is a low dose CT scan, which reduces the dose of radiation to about 1/10 of what it would be for a non-contrast CT scan. However, the sensitivity for these low dose CT scans to pick up any lung lesions in the early stages doesn't decrease. So because they're able to highlight any lesions, these are actually proven in the West to decrease lung cancer related mortality, and probably as a healthy volunteer bias, also all cause mortality has been shown to be decreased. And these are the various recommendations from across various associations, including the American Academy of Family Practice, and it also has the American College of Chest Physicians and American Society of Clinical Oncology recommending doing annual low-dose CT scans for heavy smokers. Just to share an example, this is a case of a 60-year-old gentleman, heavy smoker, who was enrolled onto the lung cancer screening program with us. His low-dose CT scan showed a lung RADS 4B lesion, which was highly suspicious for lung cancer in the right upper lobe. It was subjected to a CT-guided biopsy, which confirmed an adenocarcinoma. Fortunately for this patient, the metastatic workup was negative. He was subjected to a surgery, which was a minimally invasive VATS surgery, along with the mediastinal lymph node dissection. The final histopath for this lesion came out as a PT1N0. And because it was such a small lesion caught early, fortunately, he did not need any further adjuvant therapy as well. So to summarize the entire presentation for today, I'd just like to highlight the key take-home messages. That the primary care physician and the oncologist interaction is of paramount importance. The disease management group approach that Dr. Harith was talking about, and we follow to the core at Max Hospital, has improved expertise in the core fields of oncology. Within each DMG, we are having a multidisciplinary approach. As you could see, we have people doing their specific works. Evidence-based medicine has led to better patient outcomes. Definitely treating patients at high volume centers increases the chances of delivering a successful treatment. And in addition to that, being part of a wider cancer support network like a national cancer grid that we are a part of does help patients across the country and supports them throughout their treatment. Thanks, Dr. Shamal. And with your permission, if we have any questions, I think we can take those as well.
And I think if you don't give one or two slides or the protocol you are following for the molecular testing, you must discuss the point. Molecular testing, immunotherapy, and these are the messages. What in which cases we should advise molecular testing? Only in adenocarcinoma or in other form of myself.
Dr. Devrat, can you please elaborate on what Dr. Shamal is requesting for? Dr. Devrat?
Shubham, can you please repeat the question? I'm sorry, I lost the connection in between.
So Dr. Shamal was requesting the algorithm that we follow for starting targeted therapies.
Yeah, so obviously the first step is diagnosing the appropriate mutation. So the candidate biomarkers for target therapies are increasing. So one of the most common mutations in Indian population is EGFR, and Indian data seems to suggest that the percentage positivity rate of EGFR in adenocarcinomas in lung is anywhere between 25 and 30%. We also have about 3% incidence of ALK mutations, and then about a percentage of ROS, MET, HER2, KRAS, TERT mutation, and so on and so forth. So what we do, so obviously what is recommended now is to do a test called next generation sequencing. Now this is a test that looks at all these mutations at one go. Unfortunately, it's still very expensive and out of bounds for most of our patients. So what we end up doing is we look at the 3 or 4 more common mutations, them being EGFR, ALK, ROS1. That's what we test for along with PDL1 testing. And if one of these tests positive, then obviously any of the available drugs, we have first, second, and now third generation anti-EGFR agents available in India. Similarly, for ALK inhibition also, we have 2 different class of drugs. So any of these are initiated to begin with, and in fact, for EGFR and ALK, we also have second line agents where progression on first set of drugs doesn't mean that the patient has to go in for chemo or immuno. The patient can still be eligible for the next line of oral target therapies. So that's the schema that we follow here at Max for advanced non-small cell lung cancers.
Okay, and what is about the liquid biopsy? What is the need for liquid biopsy? What is the process?
Right. So again, an excellent question. So we've been discussing the importance of tissue for non-small cell cancers in particular and in advanced stages. And at times, there is a genuine problem in obtaining adequate tissue for these patients. Sometimes the mass may be too central, the patient's general condition may be poor, the patient may have had complication with the initial procedure, or the patient may not agree for a second biopsy if the tissue was inadequate in the first one. Now, in those cases, for certain tests, most prominently for EGFR, what could actually look at cell-free DNA, which is arising from the tumor cells and which may be circulating in the blood. So a liquid biopsy looks at isolating this cell-free DNA, and then the PCR method actually enhances the copy number. And then we do the same EGFR testing. So if you compare it with a tissue biopsy, the relative sensitivity of a liquid biopsy for diagnosing EGFR is only about 70%. So we would do a liquid biopsy upfront if the patient cannot or does not have adequate tissue. A lot of times for these patients who've actually been on some sort of target therapy, a liquid biopsy may be done once they start progressing to see what sort of change has happened. So to diagnose a EGFR mutation, to see if there is a secondary mutation, those are the things that we do. But at the same time, if a liquid biopsy turns out negative, I'd still counsel my patient to undergo a formal biopsy, because you may still miss a few cases where there may be a mutation, but a liquid biopsy may not be able to pick it up.
Is there any chance of discrepancy between the biopsy and the liquid biopsy results?
Yes, yes. So we've had cases where the main biopsy was positive and the liquid biopsy was negative, and that's logical because the amount of DNA through a liquid biopsy specimen may be of inferior quality. Now, there also have been isolated cases where a liquid biopsy turned out positive and the main biopsy was negative for the said mutation. Now, these are very rare and nobody really knows how best to treat them. We do know that tumors are very heterogeneous tissues, and most experts believe, and our own experience says, that it probably still is okay to start with the relevant target therapy if you have a positive mutation. on a liquid biopsy and negative one on a tissue biopsy. But again, this is a very rare scenario.
Now the results, I think possibly it will take about 2 weeks to come the results of this molecular testing or this liquid biopsy, whatever may be. So in the interim period, what you follow? Would you like to give chemotherapy or radiotherapy to the patient in the interim period, or wait for the results?
Again, that's a good question. So I think it all depends on the age of the patient, the performance status of the patient, the comorbidities, and the kind of symptoms, and therefore what is deciding the urgency to initiate treatment. For example, as soon as last week, in fact, 2 days ago, I had this patient who came from the periphery where there was a diagnosis of an adenocarcinoma via a bronchoscopic biopsy. The patient was 60, but he had a poor ejection fraction or LVF of about 35%. And apart from cough, absolutely no symptoms. And I think I counseled him and told him that you are the ideal case where we should subject you to all these biopsy and wait for the results. Because any treatment, be it chemotherapy or chemoimmunotherapy, may be associated with side effects which you may not be able to tolerate. But at the other extreme is the set of patient where you have a very symptomatic patient, where it is not quite appropriate to wait for the results. Obviously, if the symptom is because of a bone metastasis or a brain metastasis, the radiation oncology team takes over before we initiate systemic therapy. But a lot of times, we would have to start these patients on some sort of chemotherapy and then do a reassessment after 2 cycles to see how they're responding to it, how they're tolerating the therapy, and then decide whether you want to continue the same chemotherapy or chemoimmunotherapy, or you want to switch to the targeted therapy.
As far as regarding the targeted therapy, whenever adenocarcinoma patients coming with EGFR positive, you find EGFR positive, and you have to decide about the targeted therapy. I heard about the first, second, third generation drugs are available now in our country. Which is the best, and in which situation you will suggest it?
So we look at 2 or 3 common or very important points. One is, what is the kind of mutation that a patient is harboring? So, you could have an exon 19 or exon 21 deletion or mutation, which are considered as the common EGFR mutation, where all these generations of drugs are active. About 5 to 10% patients may have an uncommon EGFR mutation, where the data is strongest for a drug called afatinib, which is a 2nd generation EGFR inhibitor, and there's some emerging data for a 3rd generation EGFR inhibitor called osimertinib. Now, if you are dealing with a common mutation, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that the 3rd generation drug called osimertinib is the best in terms of response rates, is the best in terms of progression-free survival, and is also the best in terms of overall survival. The only caveat being that the data from Asian patients was not that promising. The other problem with this drug is that it's very costly. It's very costly. And when you look at some of the 1st generation EGFR inhibitors, the cost is as low as 2,000 or 3,000 rupees per month. So obviously data suggests that you should be going in for a 3rd generation drug, but often in our countries, and I suspect often from smaller cities, patients may not be able to afford those drugs. And
what is the comparison price you are telling about? Usually costly. 1st generation and 3rd generation.
3rd generation could be upwards of or nearly 1 lakh rupees per month. Nearly 1 lakh rupees per month. Whereas a 1st generation is around 2,500 to 5,000 rupees per month, and a 2nd generation is about 15,000-20,000 rupees. So in India, you really need to look into those cases as well, and you really need to talk economics as well. But if money is not an issue, and if there is a common EGFR mutation, I would certainly counsel the patient and give him or her the option of a 3rd generation EGFR TKI.
Now, for METS evaluation, you routinely screen brain in all the cases?
Yeah. So again, while the guidelines suggest that for any lung cancer patient with stage 3 or higher stage, a brain imaging should be done. Often in a real world clinical practice, a lot of times these patients may not be symptomatic, and often we would not do the MRI brain. We would rely on whatever information a CT scan may be able to give. Now, in patients who are able to harbor a targetable mutation, there may be some case of doing a routine brain imaging. So I might want to do an MRI brain to find if they are asymptomatic brain mets. And that may then prompt me to use an EGFR inhibitor or a ALK inhibitor, which has a greater intracranial activity. So, for example, osimertinib has a lot of intracranial activity. Similarly, when we talk about ALK inhibitors, alectinib has a lot of intracranial activities where you may or may not go in for radiation therapy straight away, especially if they're limited asymptomatic brain mets. But the choice of the EGFR or ALK inhibitor may be guided by what the brain MRI reveals.
That means if there is a brain mets, then there is no other way. We have to choose the third generation drug.
So, or if the patient cannot afford it, then obviously I would certainly seek the help of my radiation oncology colleague, give them radiation, be it stereotactic radiation therapy or whole brain RT, depending on the number of lesions there are, the size of the lesion there are, and then choose whatever systemic therapy the patient can afford.
And another question I would like to again to cover you, tell something about the immunotherapy. Immunotherapy, what are the immunotherapy? What is the concept behind immunotherapy, and how we select the patient?
Yeah, so I think immunotherapy, there has been a lot of interest in immunotherapy, and most of the initial data of immunotherapy came for malignant melanoma, which is not that common in India. And the data is based on the premise that cancer is an immunosuppressive state. A lot of these cancers are actually able to, through variety of methods, suppress our own inherent innate immunity, and therefore, not allowing the immune system to eliminate these cancers. And now, one of the most common mechanisms for the same is through secretion of certain chemicals. The most prominent and well-known is called PD-L1, which is a programmed death ligand, right? So the initial data came in for second line scenario, and I remember being in that conference in 2015 where one of the first seminal presentations was being made in that conference. And in the second line setting, immunotherapy has shown a lot of advantage, particularly in comparison to chemotherapy across histologies in both adeno and squamous, and irrespective of biomarker expression. So we look at PD-L1 expression as a biomarker for response, and in the second line setting, irrespective of what the biomarker suggested, immunotherapy was effective. Now, of late, in the past 2 years, you have first line data, and we have had different drugs, pembrolizumab, nivolumab, along with ipilimumab, durvalumab, alone or in combination with chemotherapy, and we're looking at what is the ideal scenario and what is the right population. So when I look at the choice of immunotherapy alone or with chemotherapy, I would look at 2 or 3 scenarios. I would look at what is the quantum of the disease, whether the disease seems to be rapidly progressive, as a lot of disease burden is there. What is the degree of PD-L1 expression, whether it's high. For Pembro, we use a cutoff of 1% and 50%, so whether it's higher than 50% or it's more than 1%. So for patients who have slowly progressive disease with the PD-L1 expression of more than 50%, immunotherapy alone has been shown to be much better than chemotherapy. And with one study showing survival as high as 30 months for stage 4 adenocarcinomas with PD-L1 greater than 50%. For a lot of other patients, a combination of chemotherapy and immunotherapy may be used irrespective of PD-L1 expression. And in all these scenarios, the combination has actually now shown to have a survival advantage, leading to a longer survival. Again, costly medications, and therefore may not be universally applicable to all our patients. The quantum benefit may vary from one disease to the other. So whereas it may be many months or up to a year in terms of survival advantage for adenocarcinoma, for small cell, the advantage is still to the tune of 2 or 3 months. But again, exciting prospect, and as we use them more, as greater research happens, I think we'll be able to fine tune our usage more. In fact, we've had a lot of experience with immunotherapy along with chemotherapy here at Max. Our mix of patients have been able to afford it, and I think I can safely say that the results that we are seeing in our population is very similar to what has been reported in clinical trials and seems to be very well tolerated. There is a learning curve, but once you know how to use it, how to manage the side effects, it's very practical to do in a real world setting.
So if in a case of adenocarcinoma, molecular study don't show any targeted mutation, only in that situation, we should advise for the PD-1 expression test or you do routinely.
Right. So I would still advise a PDL1 test
Yes.
because if the PDL1, as I said, if it's more than 50% and there's no targetable mutation, immunotherapy as a monotherapy is a choice.
Can be used.
And you'd know that, you don't have to give them chemotherapy, and therefore the tolerability of the regimen is going to be much better. Now, if the PDL1 is less than 50%, irrespective of then the degree of positivity, then the option that I use for most of these patients is a combination of chemotherapy and immunotherapy. Now, most of the patients with a targeted mutation are eliminated. So I would not use a combination of chemo or immuno unless I've totally exhausted my target therapy option. So for EGFR mutated patient with an adenocarcinoma, immunotherapy, chemotherapy would be slotted somewhere in the third line setting, where the first and second line settings have been used. Although there is now some emerging evidence to suggest that a chemo-immuno combination, certain chemotherapy immunotherapy combination may still be used in the first line setting, even for a EGFR mutated patient.
So immunotherapy can be given to all sorts of lung cancers, small cell, non-small cells.
Yes. But then, there are different immunotherapeutic agents. So
yes, agents are different. Okay.
6 or 7 different immunotherapies. There's 6 or 7 different ways of doing the PDL1 testing. I think those are the things that one needs to look into with greater depth before deciding what's the best drug for the particular patient.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question to Dr. Subham. And what is the place of surgery in our country at the place movement in lung cancer? How frequently you do as an curative therapy and as an palliative?
So it depends on the stage at which we are able to detect the lesion. That is why we are trying hard to push the screening in lung cancer program as well at Max Saket. Definitely the smaller the lesion, the earlier we find the nodes. If they are not involved, that's preferable. Even if they're involved after chemotherapy, we do try and take the patients up for surgery. Now, even in oligometastatic cases, and Dr. Charu would agree with me, there are instances where we can offer surgery to these patients. So
curative treatment in which stage? Curative treatment in which situation? Only nodule, no glands, no nodes.
So even in the presence of nodes, the multimodal approach, surgery alone may not be the solution to these patients, but with a multimodal approach, wherein the patient may require, depending on the stage, the nodal involvement, the size of the disease, may even after surgery need chemotherapy and radiotherapy and still be curative. Dr. Charu, would you want to elaborate on that further?
So I would say that, till stage 3A, it is basically still the surgeon's domain. It is only in late 3B where, the radiation and chemo takes a precedence over surgery. So with N1 nodes and, single nodal N2 nodes and the primary, which is resectable, it goes to the surgeons. And as like what we were talking, the concept of oligomets in lung now, that is like, even a metastatic disease, limited number, we still try and go for a radical treatment with the help of.
For example, what the image we show of the patient with lung cancer and chest wall infiltration, and as Dr. Charu was saying, had the patient been fit, probably even that much extent of disease is something which is amenable to surgical resection. Obviously, we do at times need to back the treatment up, the surgery up with chemotherapy and radiotherapy as is relevant to reduce the chances of a recurrence later. So all these modalities never work in isolation, and that's what we've seen works best for the patient.
I think case by case discussion is the key. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a very good discussion.
Thank you, Dr.
Is there any question? Is there questions in the chat box?
No questions in the chat box that I find, sir. But I think we're already slightly over time, and I'd like to request Dr. Gangopadhyay to please close the session. It was a very interactive session and we loved it. Dr. Gangopadhyay, are you there? Dr.
It's just put a
Gangopadhyay.
chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Sarkar, then I
Dr.
think.
Abhishek has also put a comment there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Gangopadhyay.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it was a great opportunity because we get lots of lung cancer cases and often we are clueless what to do next, where to send them. But today you people could shed a lot of light on what to do, and I'm sure our daily practice path will be a bit smoother. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Atri. Thank you.
And as I discussed with Dr. Sarkar, definitely it's something that we hold each other's hand while managing such patients. And it's never one person's individual domain. It's more of a team-based approach that can help out.
So I think we can explore the possibility of a tumor board, joint tumor board also. Let us look at that as well.
So I think there is a difference from the working environment, your place and our place. So what I think
tumor board can cover a lot of these gaps actually.
Yes. What
Sharing
I think
continuously will help a lot.
Yes. What I think the pulmonologists who are practicing individually and they are detecting patients, diagnosing patients with lung cancer, and they are referring the patient to the oncologist or refer to some institution. So one thing I have noticed that there is no feedback or no further touch with the patient. What's happening? That's one of the important cause of less interest in the lung cancer chapter amongst the pulmonologists, because all other diseases like bronchial asthma, COPD, even ILD, or even tuberculosis, including MDR-TB, each and every disease other than lung cancer are dealt with individually by the pulmonologist.
So that is why a tumor board is the best idea, because and what this lockdown has told us, that having a virtual meeting like this, you are sitting 1500 kilometers apart from us, but we are able to talk, we are able to share, we are able to discuss, and with so good connectivity that
and that also sitting in our homes.
In our homes, it is,
definitely.
And we can choose a time
away from our commitments. Yes. So all this is possible today because of the virtual connection. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
And so many
and
things
the quality is
possible.
maintained. Best thing is quality is maintained.
And so many things are possible at your center itself, and obviously once they require a multimodal, they shift to a place where everything is available, but giving you the opportunity to work them up the right way would be the first ladder to start with, sir.
So one thing is sure that we have to work hard for the early diagnosis of this patient for overall improvement in the outcome. So with the pulmonologist as well as the physicians or general physician should be much more alert while dealing with this sort of the patients, and high index of suspicion must be needed, and we should always try to do an early diagnosis to give a better prognosis or better outcome to the patients. So today you did a very good webinar, and all the aspects of the lung cancer have been covered, I think. And it is definitely enlightening and a learning for us as well. And I thank you on the behalf of Jharkhand Chest Society, all the members, for arranging.
Before I close, I want to again invite you for the conference.
Yes.
We look forward for a good engagement.
Thank you very much. I will forward that invitation to all the members.
Yes, sir. Please, to all of your colleagues. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Good night.